1. So a little story from years ago about an assistant manager that doesn't understand the work at all. I worked as a security guard driving around industrial areas and responding to alarms that go off at the buildings from our clients. When I started there, I was told and learned to ask for proper ID, driving license, passport, ID card, if I encounter someone in the building. Which was very common, as most alarms came from people not turning off the alarm in time or entering the wrong code. And note their details in the report. But, and this will be important later on, if they can't show ID, kindly request them to leave and close the building. If they refuse, call police to deal with it. Some background to make things clearer. Laws here make it so that security guards are just civilians, which means I can ask for ID, but if they refuse to give it, there's nothing I can do. Only law enforcement officers can demand IDs. Also, my assistant manager hates me for some reason, always looking for something to pin on me. So for a few years I do this as I was taught. Ask for ID if I found someone in the building, and ask them to leave if they refused or didn't have one with them. Some would show credit cards or other things with their name on it, then I would write it in my report, but still ask them to leave. All this time, the assistant manager would go over these reports in the morning, but I never heard any complaint about it, so I was doing things right, I thought. After a few years on this particular day, I get an alarm, so I drove there. I arrive at the building, go in, and find the cleaning lady doing her job. The alarm system log shows she entered the wrong code the first time, and was just a little too late entering it correct the second time, as would happen a lot. I kindly ask her for an ID, and she tells me she doesn't have any with her. She shows me a bank card with her name. I write down the name in the report, including it was from a bank card, and tell her she has to leave. She understands, picks up her stuff and leaves. I finish my report and go on my merry way. The next morning I receive an email from my assistant manager, going mental over the fact that I sent the cleaning lady away without noting down proper ID details, and telling me the client is mad because they wanted to know who was in the building. I calmly reply that I did what I always did and was instructed to do when I joined the company, and had been doing without any issue for the last 3 or 4 years. The reply came fast with detailed instructions. If someone doesn't have proper ID on them, you call the police and have them identify the person so you can note it in your report. The assistant manager also made a memo stating this to everyone in the unit, which I of course also made a copy of. As the good employee that I am, I followed that instruction to the letter. Most others didn't, as they weren't targeted by the assistant managers, so they could do whatever they wanted. I called the police every time a person couldn't show me proper ID, which happened almost every shift I worked, if not multiple times in a single shift, leading to a few employees of clients actually being arrested for failing to identify to a law enforcement officer. This wasn't my intention at all. Some police officers were jerks and just arrested them, even though they could verify the identity of someone fairly simple on location. The police calling my manager, why the hell they were called every single day to go to confirm someone's name because they didn't have ID on them, and multiple clients calling my manager asking why a simple alarm was taking 3 times longer than usual. Clients have to pay per 15 minutes I am on site, after the initial 15 minutes have passed, and refusing to pay the extra fee for me waiting for the police to show up. As expected, I got invited for a talk with my manager and assistant manager to discuss some things. Basically, my manager wanted to chew me out over all these calls he had been getting, let alone people being arrested. The next day, I sit down with my manager and the assistant manager, being very cheerful as his favorite target was getting a huge reprimand. The manager asks me why I call the police every time someone doesn't have a proper ID, asking me if I have any idea how pissed off the police is, and how many clients are refusing to pay the fee because it takes so much longer now I have to wait for the police. Basically, I cost the company a lot of money. After the manager has asked these questions, I pull out my folder containing the email conversation with the assistant manager, instructing me to do exactly that. and the copy of the now conveniently disappeared from the office memo with the same instructions, both signed by assistant manager. The same assistant manager that is now turning pale, realizing what I'm about to hand over to the manager. I calmly explain to the manager while he is reading both papers that I am only following the instructions given to me, as I had clearly been doing it wrong for the last 3 to 4 years prior to this incident. The face of the manager is slowly turning red from anger, while the assistant manager is turning paler by the second. Before the manager explodes, he asks me to go grab a coffee and wait till he calls me back in. They needed to go over these papers and decide what they would do with me. Sure thing, boss. While I'm enjoying my coffee, I can hear my manager go mental to his assistant. Multiple things like, "How can you be so stupid?" and "They have it on paper, you idiot!" are clearly heard across the entire floor. When I get called back in, I can see my assistant manager sitting silently, shamefully, behind his computer, attempting to avoid any and all eye contact with me. The manager calmly explains he wasn't aware of these papers, and that I should follow the instructions as all other employees should. Saving face, as admitting this was wrong and changing the instructions would mean defeat of the management, and that he would inform all clients about this so they can avoid these kinds of incidents. I spent the next 9 years following these instructions, which angered the assistant manager, as he would read my reports every morning, telling about how the police had to show up again and again for something silly. Eventually, they found a way to get rid of me, reassigning me to a new position, which I gladly accepted, as the work was a lot more fun. I actually became a law enforcement officer with that switch. The pay was better and the hours were even sweeter. 2. So this happened about a little over a year ago. I was living on my own for the first time while going to school, and was struggling to get by after depleting what I had left from student loans. I started handing out resumes and filling out applications, and got a job at a chain drugstore. My manager was a really good guy. He's in his late 20s, and from what I gauged during my time there, it was more inexperience than anything else that led to my undesirable instances working there. During the interview, he lets me know that they'll have me starting out as a post office clerk, because it's the hardest to learn, and that he wanted every employee, new or old, to learn it at some point. This is because when I arrived, there were only 3 people in the entire store that truly knew what they were doing with the alien postal point-of-sale system. So naturally, it was difficult to schedule and they needed help. The problem with working at the post office is there are a bunch of things that are very simple to do, but there are also many things that aren't, which have tons of options and menus and specifics, and it's just a lot when you start to learn it. Redirecting mail from old addresses to new ones, opening and closing P.O. boxes, and even simply mailing something internationally all requires an elaborate string of menus. Think of it as a dungeon in The Legend of Zelda. Sometimes you get close to the final room, but you forgot something along the way. It's tedious and fucking exhausting after a few hours, when you sorta know what you're doing and have an entire line of people concerned that you don't know what you're doing. The girl who trained me was around my age, and while she was sweet and meant well, she wasn't trained to train, if that makes sense. So instead of going through things in a linear way so that it was easier to understand, we were all over the place the whole time. I spent most of my first few shifts taking notes of the simple and common things, and eventually more elaborate ones, and organizing away incoming packages for pickup. I took notes for like the first 3 weeks, about 6 or 7 shifts. I addressed my concerns with the training, but was brushed aside pretty quickly, and was told to just ask questions. I was thinking, I'll learn this eventually, and I did, fully, over a month and a half after I started. In all honesty, I don't know where the training shifts began and ended, which is never a good sign. So at this point, we're about a month into me working there, and I show up to work to see one of my AM's assistant manager. She's the focus of this here tale, with a new girl I hadn't seen before. This assistant manager was not one of the 3 people in the store that understood exactly how to do everything, but she could get by a little better than I at this point, undoubtedly. She introduces us and explains that today is her first shift, and drumroll please, that I'll have the duty of helping to train her.
Well, I guess I'll just leave you two to it.
AKA I'll sit in the cash office and do basically nothing for the next couple hours. I do my best to give her the really easy stuff first and help her along. She's taking notes, looking at mine, and trying to help here and there before I just teach her how to organize the back room so I can get through the massive line that has conjured. I'm a little frustrated because I haven't got a break, and it's been close to 5 hours at this point, me working alone at a post office, without actually knowing how to do a third of what we do. A woman comes in after the line disperses and explains she wants to send some gifts to a friend in France. She takes out an Apple Watch, a piece of clothing of sorts, and something else with decent value that escapes me at the moment. Anyway, we find an adequate box to ship it in, and we get the address on it. Alright, so let me look like I know what I'm doing until I don't, and let me go ask my manager. I find the assistant manager in the break room, which is where I probably should have been instead.
What do you need?
Yeah, so I haven't done a whole lot of international shipping, and this woman is sending out some pretty expensive things to France, so I don't want to make a mistake.
Well, nobody else is here that can work there, and I'm on break right now. You've been here a couple of months, huh? So you should be able to do it by now.
Well, I've tried writing down notes, and I've been doing transactions on my own a lot more. It's just that there's a lot of stuff to learn, so it's hard to get it all in up there, you know?
You just need to go through it slowly.
I sigh and go back, as I'm too tired to do anything but just get it over with. I asked the lady if she wanted to maybe come back tomorrow, as I was somewhat new, and may take a bit of time to make sure everything is done properly, hoping she would agree. She didn't, and explained she didn't really have the time and wanted to do it now. Totally understandable, and I felt bad, but what was I to do? I just tried my best. What I haven't mentioned at this point is the wild amount of custom stuff in different form types we have in our drawers under the point of sale. I didn't really have the hang of which form was for which methods and duration of shipment. I deliberated with inner monologue and thought I had found the correct form, and proceeded to have her fill it out and finish a transaction that I was not supremely confident in. Assistant manager finally shows her face a little later and asks me about it. I more or less just give her a thumbs up. I finally get a break a couple hours before my shift ends, and thankfully, the rest of the night is dead, and I teach the new girl cash out and leave. Somewhere around 3 weeks later, I get into work after having a couple of days off. Trainer girl is there and asks me about a woman who wanted to ship some expensive stuff to France, before I explained that there wasn't anyone here and AM pretty much stuck me with it. So apparently this lady showed up and went insane, exclaiming that I hadn't sent her package properly and that she was going to call the police before storming out once AM told her there wasn't anything she could do about it, and that if her address was on it, then it should return if there are complications and can be refunded. I go to clock in and hear my name from the cash office to my left.
David, I need to speak with you before you clock in.
Sure, AM, what do you need?
Do you remember the woman who came in about a month ago sending expensive stuff to France?
Yeah, I do.
Well, she came in yesterday screaming at me about how she thinks you didn't send out the package properly because they haven't received it. And I had to calm her down and try to figure everything out, and you told me it was fine.
I was having difficulties figuring things out, and honestly, haven't been formally trained, so I just tried to take it slow, as you advised, and do my best.
Well, at least it's sorted out, and she didn't call the police.
I clock in while chuckling in my head. She knows she fucked up. And get on with my duties as postal clerk. 3. Several years back, I worked at a call center in its death throes, doing tech support for a small, primary, business-based ISP that was also dying due to terrible service, insane prices, and not changing with the times. So one of the managers wrote up by hand this handy-dandy cheat sheet that had a ton of numbers to different departments, manufacturing companies, and other places we regularly had to send customs to. It was honestly good to have it, as it saved tons of time searching for the numbers every time you needed them. The problem was, however, that one of the numbers at the bottom that every agent used about 30 times a day had a typo, or was poorly written, basically a 7 that looked like a 9 or vice versa. Turns out that one number was the difference between speaking to some banking router maker or busty college teens who wanted nothing more in life than to talk dirty to you for $3.99 a minute. If we did what we were supposed to, this is a call transfer. For those lucky enough to not know call center lingo, it's when you transfer the call without waiting to talk to someone on the other line to explain why the customer is calling. You just transfer and end the call without walking the customer through or waiting to hear the other line. It's essentially a "this isn't our problem anymore, so see you later" transfer. For about a solid month or two, about 100 agents had been transferring hundreds if not thousands of people a day to this phone sex line. I was on a call with an old lady, and I had to transfer the call over, but I needed a few moments to finish writing my notes before the next one came in, so instead of hanging up as soon as I heard the ringing telling me it was transferring, I just connected the call and muted myself for a second. She was gonna have to listen to the options for about 3 minutes and wait on hold anyway, though it's not like I would hear anything. That's when, instead of hearing the "thanks for calling so-and-so," I heard a soft, sexy lady's voice come on the line and say, "Hey there, sexy. I heard you like hot, busty college girls, and that you want to blah blah." I'll let your imagination fill in the rest. I was already reaching for the hang-up when I heard the lady on the other line gasp in surprise. After laughing at the surprise when I realized what had happened, I looked at the sheet and cross-checked it with the database, and that's when I saw the 7 was written to look like a 9 by mistake or bad handwriting. The same sheet that was just photocopied, laminated, and handed out to every employee with a note to be mandated by our betters is to be stuck on the wall of each cubicle and exclusively used from now on instead of the database. I asked about 7 or 8 people without telling them what the number was, and they all told me the same incorrect number. So me being young and dumb, I thought I had discovered something the managers on call would be happy to hear about, and go around correcting everyone's sheet with a red marker or something simple. Instead, I got yelled at for being off the phones when I should be taking calls. They didn't even want to hear what I said and told me unless the building's on fire or my shift is over, I need to get back to my seat and stop bothering them. They claimed I was lying and trying to get out of working. I'm here to answer phone calls and not to think. So instead of just taking a second to dial the number and confirm the error, they decided to lecture me. Managers. Surprised, I just shook my head and went back to my desk. I explained what had happened, and everyone on the floor tried it to see and had a good laugh about it. Instead of making the correction, though, we did as we were told and kept using the incorrect number. About a month went by before they finally got enough complaints from customers to launch an investigation into what was happening, and how this mysterious problem could be happening. Meanwhile, it was an open secret every frontline agent knew. Sadly, no one got in trouble, and the call center shut down about 6 months later, out of the blue, as they are wont to do. But at least all the frontline agents got to have a good laugh at the expense of rude and ignorant management. Whenever we had to transfer someone, it was a highlight of our day, because it felt like we were sticking it to the management. And at least the shitty company lost some money assigning people to investigate the problem. 4. When I was a senior at high school, and this is going on 35 years ago now, I got pretty good grades. It's no real secret. I was bright, my parents made sure I worked my backside off, and I was really lucky to get into a great school. It was an exam and interview to get in. My parents weren't well off, so they made damn sure I worked at school, because it was the best opportunity I was ever going to get. So time passes, and I'm doing fairly well in school. Top streams for everything. Took Maths O level a year early, so I could take the AO level when most people were doing O. This was all setting up for doing 6 A-levels in 6th form, so it was a big deal and most of the teachers knew who was doing it. Mr. P took me for Spanish in one of those streams, and one day he asked me to stay behind. He started to sell me on taking another O-level at the same time I was taking Maths AO. I was interested, thinking it was Spanish. I like Spanish, but no. Mr. P was trying to establish another course for himself as an RE religious education teacher, and he was doing it by showing the headmaster, the principal for Americans, that he could take a small chosen group of people through a year's instruction and get them past the exam. He'd been doing it apparently for a couple of years now, and every single student had gotten an A, or at least that's what he claimed. He made a big deal about how the perfect record was really important to establishing RE as an exam course, rather than a couple of weekly free periods at the school. The thing is, even then I was not at all religious. Brown suits were the root of the cause, but the upshot was that I wasn't even vaguely interested in studying for a year, learning stuff that I didn't care about, when I had real things to worry about like thermodynamics and stoichiometric equations. I politely said no thanks. He got insistent I was ideal, I'd regret it if I didn't take the opportunity. It would be good for my grades, etc., etc. No thanks, I'm just not interested. I have to go now. And left for my next class. That night he phoned my parents. This was the unforgivable sin, if you'll pardon the pun, because my mother is religious and she jumped on it. Parents have a lot more leverage than teachers, or at least they did in my day. Long story. We won't mention the screaming matches, the tantrums, the sulky silences, etc. Short, I ended up doing RE. So every time I turned up for that darn class, taking away two precious free periods every week, I resented what was happening more and more. Eventually, it focused into hard-as-diamond hatred of the subject and of Mr. P. All the time I kept my head down, did the work, and smiled for the camera. My in-class grades were good. Where is the malicious compliance, I hear you ask? Well, it was partly in the last paragraph. My sweet smiling on the outside, the boiling anger on the inside. But mainly when it came to exam time. When my exam results came through, I had 7 A grades, 3 B grades, and 1 F on that RE paper. I had written 2 things, my name and in clear writing. It doesn't seem very Christian to force people to take tests. I left that face up on the desk so Mr. P, the main exam invigilator, could read it when he collected it. Then got up and left, 5 minutes after the start. I made sure to smile at him on the way out of the hall. He couldn't follow, of course. He never spoke to me again. I didn't take Spanish for A-level, 3 maths, physics, chemistry, and GS, so I didn't have to interact, and I always behaved as if nothing had happened if we passed in the corridor. I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think he ever took another group through an accelerated RE course again. My parents weren't happy either, but I stuck with, you said I had to take the course and do the exam, and I did. They never said I had to try hard in the exam. They, like Mr. P, just assumed I would. They got over it a lot faster than Mr. P did. 5. This story is a couple years old, and like many things on the internet, you wait for the heat to die off to reduce the chance of recognition by parties involved. I was leading a team of technicians that included an on-call component. Every 4 to 6 weeks it was your turn on the roster to carry the phone and be available 24/7. You could live your life normally, but we advise techs not to plan a family event that they can't leave unexpectedly, or a weekend trip more than an hour or 2 away from the office while on call. If you wanted to change the schedule, you needed a colleague to volunteer to swap. The roster was generated a few months in advance, and we had a very firm rule after being burned a couple of times. No change is permanent until it's confirmed in the schedule. Meaning myself or my supervisors had received a written confirmation from both parties. People have a tendency to change plans, so we made sure the team knew the bare minimum was an email from both techs agreeing to the change. Then we update the schedule, then it is locked in stone. There are a few players to this melodrama: me, the manager of all the teams in the area, my supervisor for Bob's team, Henry, the tech receiving malicious complaints, Bob, and the young tech who got screwed out of a weekend, Jim. Jim wants to attend a concert on a weekend he's scheduled to be on call. Jim successfully convinces Bob over lunch to swap with him, and sends us an email to confirm. Very important to note that Henry and a few others are eating lunch with them. Henry hears the whole conversation. Bob does not reply with his acceptance, so there's no changes made at that time, and everyone goes home for the day. When Bob eventually came clean, I learned what happened next. Bob mentions to his wife that evening that the week on call he will swap with Jim. Bob's wife is not happy with this, and points out she wants to see her mother that weekend, so she demands he swap back. Normally, if Bob had confirmed the change, it would be 100% his job to find a volunteer to take over. But Bob realizes he never agreed via email, so decides to play sneaky. He was a bit of a macho kind of guy, so I think a lot of what happened next was based on avoiding the appearance of his wife telling him what to do. The next day, Bob responds in writing that actually there was not an agreement and he wouldn't take the shift. Taking everyone by surprise is the fact that he didn't frame it as, "Actually, I can't take that shift," but instead with "Jim is lying, I never said that." Jim is upset he'll miss his concert, but per the rules, he is out of luck. There's suddenly tension in the office and techs taking sides between Bob and Jim. Not a great situation for an esprit de corps, so it's time for management to get involved. Henry wants to handle it, but he's a bit too riled up, so I pull Bob aside instead. I ask Bob what's going on, hint that multiple people have upheld Jim's version of events. Is there something we can do here to ease the tension? I'm asking you to be a team player here and come clean for me. You don't have to take the shift, but I don't like when techs are mudslinging each other.
No. Jim's a liar and the rest of them must have heard it wrong, or they're lying too. I never agreed to this, and I don't want to be a team player with these liars.
You don't want to be a team player, is that right?
Yes, I'm just going to look out for myself, since I can't trust these young guys on the team like Jim.
Whatever you say, Bob. Cue the malicious compliance. For the rest of the year, every time Bob needed a hand, he was left hanging, within reason. I'm not risking my own performance numbers here. Difficult job that would be easier with two? Sorry, Bob. All the older team members are scheduled elsewhere. You'll have to do it alone since you don't trust these younger techs. Bob wants a hand moving some equipment to the delivery van. Sorry. The team is busy with other tasks. I'm sure you can handle it solo. Bob got the picture pretty quick that severing himself from the team was a bad idea. But from stubbornness or machismo, he stuck it out and refused to come clean or stop glaring at the newer team members. Evidently, to preserve his version of events, he had to maintain an air of distrust of the younger techs. Or he just blamed them collectively, I don't know. That carried on until end-of-year reviews came around. In our office, you could pick a few personal objectives, and this was a great way to get a good review even if you had a bad year. For example, some people set educational goals and got a new certificate or two in the company e-learning portal, which, if achieved, would lift their average performance score. Bob, in his infinite wisdom, had listed a few personal objectives that were remarkably social in nature. Teamwork was one. Sharing knowledge with new team members was another. These were pretty good objectives for an older, more experienced tech who could lend a hand to teammates and get some positive feedback to show his bosses by the end of the year. These were not good objectives to have when you have clearly stated you are not a team player and have been working almost completely solo for half the year. The fallout? Bob took a pretty big hit on his performance scores that year. It lowered his bonus by a few $100, and for the first time in years, there were no glowing reviews by colleagues that he could use to his advantage. Not to mention his own words being thrown back in his face on all his personal objectives. I had Henry signal me quietly as the meeting was winding down, so I could drop by and add my 2 cents. To a very crestfallen Bob, I asked, "Still feeling like you don't want to be a team player, Bob? We missed your old self these past few months." Bob takes a moment to respond and then starts laughing. He shakes his head a bit and answers,
"You're right. I do miss being a team player. Things got a little out of hand. I'll focus on that for next year."
I told him I was glad to hear it and gave a wink to Henry, and their meeting continued in a much more positive note after I left. The whole saga had taken about 6 months, but in the end, Bob apologized to Henry for lying. The next week, Bob took Jim out for lunch and spent the next year being the absolute gold star example of a team player. I spent some political capital arguing with HR, and was able to give him a raise at his next review in recognition of his efforts. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to Revenge is Ice Cream, episode 68+1. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. While it is nice to see a story of an arrogant, stubborn colleague who learns their lesson, we can all be a bit pig-headed at times, but I would hope most of us can put the pride aside, for the sake of, quite frankly, getting out of our own way and making everybody's lives easier. Oh wait, no, I'm talking about human beings here, never mind. Okay, and with that... And yes, I know exactly what I did. And with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.